Wren was cross-legged on the flat gray rock by the tide pool, 7 shells arranged by spiral count and rim width with the seriousness of a child who considers classification a sacred act. Reese was beside her with a small brown shell, half-eaten, and the specific innocent expression worn only by 4-year-olds who are absolutely certain no one saw. "Reese," I said. "We had 7. He looked at me with those eyes. Iron gray, precise, the color of a winter shoreline at dusk. The color I had never quite managed to erase from either of my children. A signature written in genetics I had never consented to share. He held up 6 fingers. 6 shells, Mama. There are 6. The 7th one, he said, pointing at the empty patch of rock, was soft. I think it was already broken. I laughed. Because my children made me laugh every single day. Because laughter was the tide wall I had built this life behind. Because once, for a long time, I had believed I would never laugh like this again. That was the exact moment I looked up and saw him standing at the garden gate. Kalen Voss, Alpha King of the Ironvale Territory. The man who had chosen my sister at my wedding. Standing at the low wooden gate of my Ashford herb garden, 500 miles from his throne, looking at me the way a man looks when he has been rehearsing the moment for years and found that no rehearsal was enough. He looked at me. Then he looked at the twins. Then the gate post was the only thing keeping him upright. Not a feint. A recognition so total it removed every other function from his body for the duration of one long, held breath. Quick pause, comment where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. I've got a lot more coming. Chapter 1. I was not supposed to be the one standing in that antechamber. That is the part one have had to tell myself over and over in the 5 years since, not to make the wound smaller, but to make it accurate. Because the wound was real. Because what happened that morning had weight and teeth and a name. But it was not an accident. It was a decision. Multiple decisions, made by multiple people who had cataloged me and found me wanting in one specific, efficient way. I was the wrong sister for the paperwork. The gown had been my grandmother's idea. Not the fabric. That was mine. Ivory with embroidered water flowers along the hem, the kind of quiet detail that would have gone unnoticed by the ceremony, but would have mattered deeply to me. She had stitched the bodice herself over 3 winter evenings, hunched over her lamplight the way she always hunched when something mattered, her needle working in the small patient movements of a woman who believes love is built in increments. She pressed it into my hands the morning before I left for the Voss stronghold and said only, "You deserve a life that fits." I had understood what she meant. I had not yet understood what it would cost to claim it. The stronghold antechamber was lit by candles, dozens of them in iron sconces along the stone walls, and the light fell warm and golden over everything in the way that light falls over things it does not know are about to break. I had flowers pinned through my hair. Small white blossoms from the Marin garden, the kind that grow wild along the eastern hedgerow and have no formal name, but smell like early summer and mean, to me, specifically, the afternoon my mother taught me to braid. The wolf tooth pendant my mother had worn at her own wedding sat cool and solid at my collarbone. I had touched it twice already, not from nerves, but from the specific quiet pleasure of a woman who believes something is finally beginning. My wolf knew his. She had known since the night we first met at the Border Summit 2 years ago. When Kalen Voss stood across a treaty table and his eyes found mine, and something in the base of my spine went still and certain in a way that had never happened before and has never happened since. She had been steady and unambiguous about it every day after. There was no question in her. There is never a question when the bond is real. Lord Brennan came in through the side door. He was a tall man, Brennan, dry and deliberate, the kind of man who considers every word before he speaks it and considers none of them afterward. He had 2 guards behind him, which was unnecessary, and he had the expression of someone completing an administrative task, which was worse. He did not look at me. He addressed my father. The ceremony, he said, had been reassigned. He did not say replaced. He said reassigned, in the same tone one might use to discuss a shift in seating arrangements or the rerouting of a supply cart. The Alpha King, after full consultation with the Elder Council, had selected a sold Marin of the Southern Estates as the more politically sound mate. The pure bloodline offered specific strategic advantages for the Northern Expansion Accords. The Alpha King had agreed to this recommendation. The ceremony would proceed as scheduled. A different bride would walk the aisle. My father said something. I do not remember what. I remember the candles. I remember that the gown fit exactly as my grandmother had promised it would. I remember that the wolf tooth pendant was warm from my skin. And I remember the 20 seconds I had. I counted them. I counted everything that morning, because counting is what you do when the ground drops out and you need something to hold. The 20 seconds I had before the tears would have come, if I had let them. 20 seconds in which to make the only decision that remained entirely mine. I removed the wolf tooth pendant and set it on the vanity beside the untouched bridal bouquet. I did not leave a note. I had nothing to say to anyone in that room that would have served any purpose other than to give them the satisfaction of my grief, and I was not willing to do that. I watched the ceremony from the stone corridor above the great hall. I don't know what compelled me to do that rather than simply leave. Perhaps I needed to see it. Perhaps my wolf needed to see it, needed to watch the invocation fail in real time, needed to hear the silence where the seal should have answered, needed to understand in her bones what we were walking away from, and why walking was the only thing left to do. Isolde walked the aisle in a gown I would later learn had been measured 3 weeks before my replacement. She had planned ahead. I had not known my sister was capable of planning that far ahead for anything other than her own comfort. I had apparently underestimated her. Kaelin stood at the altar the way a man stands when he has been told to stand somewhere and has decided not to argue with it in front of witnesses. His jaw was locked. His hands were white at the knuckles, pressed against the sides of his ceremonial trousers. His eyes did not search for mine. That was the thing I held on to in the corridor in the weeks after. His eyes did not look up. He had made a decision, and he was executing it with the particular terrible discipline of a man who has confused authority with the suppression of everything worth having. The bond invocation was spoken. You cannot seal an Alpha King to the wrong mate. Nothing answered. I felt it from 30 feet above, the bond trying to find him and finding only stone where he was meant to be. I left through the kitchen passage before the final words were spoken. My bag was already at the servants' entrance. I had packed it myself the night before, in the way that women pack bags when they know something has already ended, but are not yet ready to say the word for what it is. 3 days of clothing. My mother's herbal notes. The small iron wolf figurine my grandmother had carved from driftwood for my 7th birthday. The wolf tooth pendant I retrieved from the vanity on my way out of the antechamber. I had changed my mind about leaving it. It took 2 days on the road west before the tears came. Not in the stronghold, not in front of any of them. At a roadside in 3 provinces over, in a room that smelled of pine resin and strangers, sitting on the edge of a narrow bed with my hands in my lap and nobody watching. I gave myself 1 night. That was the agreement I made with myself. 1 night, and then we are building. The grief that came was not what I had expected. I had expected to cry for Kaelin, for the mate bond, for the morning I had planned, for the future I had imagined with an alpha king who stood at treaty tables and looked at me like I was the only certain thing in the room. And I did cry for that. A little. Briefly. What I was not prepared for was how much longer I cried for Isolde. For the girl whose hair I had braided on summer mornings. For every small thing I had believed about her that turned out to be a story I had told myself, because the truth was lonelier. Then the crying stopped. And in the silence afterward, the specific silence of a woman who has finished grieving and has not yet decided what to do with the remaining hours, something else arrived. Small, careful, foundational. The first faint architecture of a question. What if I built something that was entirely mine? I did not know, sitting on that narrow in bed with pine resin in the air and the western road ahead of me, what the answer would become. I did not know about the twins yet. I did not know about Ashford, or the midwife practice, or the tide pools, or the way salt air feels on a cold morning when you have nowhere you are required to be and the life around you is, completely and irrevocably, your own. I know now. I have known for 5 years. And then Kaelin Voss appeared at my garden gate, holding himself upright against the post with his knuckles white and his eyes full of something that had survived the full weight of what he had done to deserve it. And the morning I had built so carefully around my children and my title schedule and my sea lavender came to a stop around me, and I thought, with a clarity that surprised even me, you are standing on the sea lavender. It seemed important to say that first. Chapter 2. The sea lavender was already in the ground when I found the Ashford cottage. That was what decided it. Not the price, though the price was the kind of price that exists in places polite maps omit, and not the fog, which arrived every morning at a time that suggested it had its own schedule and no particular interest in yours. It was the sea lavender. A whole sprawling hedge of it along the eastern garden wall, silver green and salt-bitten, flowering in that specific resolute shade of purple that means nothing about elegance and everything about surviving winter. I knew how to grow sea lavender. My mother had taught me. I took the cottage. The pregnancy I discovered 6 weeks after leaving. I was not surprised. I was not surprised. I sat in the small room above the Ashford Harbour Master's office, which I was renting by the week while I looked for something permanent, and I held the knowledge very carefully and turned it over and looked at all of its sides. The way you hold a piece of sea glass to determine if it has any edges left. It had edges. Everything that matters has edges. But sea glass does not stop being beautiful for having them. I did not consider going back. I want to be precise about that, because the story people tell about women in my position always includes a moment of heroic deliberation, the long night of weighing options, the tearful near return, the dramatic final choice. There was none of that. The deliberation lasted approximately 4 minutes and arrived at the same answer from every direction. A man who traded his mate bond for a territorial calculation would find a way to trade his children next. The children were mine. The children would remain mine. The only question after that was how. My mother arrived 3 weeks later. I had not asked her to come. She appeared at the cottage door with 2 bags, her herb-grinding stone, and the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is not going to explain it. She said, "I brought the winter simples, and I know a midwife in the next village who will train you properly." Saren Marin has never in her life waited for an invitation to the place she was needed, and she was not going to start now on my account. Rhys arrived first, screaming, fists already curled, opinions fully formed from his first breath. The midwife, Dara, broad-shouldered and unflappable, the kind of woman who has seen everything and is bored by most of it, said she had delivered several hundred babies, and this one was the loudest at entry and clearly intended to continue that way. She was not wrong. Ren arrived 4 minutes later, silent, wide-eyed, already observing. She did not cry. She looked at the room with the careful attention of a person cataloging something, and then she looked at me, and then she appeared to reach some private conclusion and relaxed into my arms as though she had assessed the situation and found it acceptable. I named them for what they were. Reese, because it means ardor, and he had arrived with more of it than any person I had ever met, and he was 12 minutes old. Ren, because wrens are small and quiet and miss nothing and will absolutely destroy you if you underestimate them. I told no one their father's name. The birth record listed their father as unknown, and I filed it myself, and I have never once lost a night's sleep over it. The midwife practice grew from a borrowed room and a handwritten sign. I had my mother's herbal training, Dara's mentorship, and a coastal town's worth of women who had driven 2 provinces over for competent care and were intensely relieved to find it on their own doorstep. Ashford asked no questions. That was the other thing that had decided the cottage for me. Though I hadn't known it at the time, Ashford was a town that had been keeping its own council since before the Iron Vale expansion maps were drawn. And it was not going to start being curious about a midwife and her mother and 2 dark-haired children now. There were mornings in those first 2 years when I was tired in a way that went past the body and into something closer to the architecture of the self. When Reese had been up twice in the night with his teeth and Ren had her recurrent fever, and there were 3 women in the village expecting within the same fortnight, and the herb garden needed tending, and the cottage roof needed patching, and I was 26 years old, and it was raining in Ashford in the specific relentless way it rains in coastal towns in autumn, which is to say as though it has every intention of continuing forever. Those mornings existed. I am not going to pretend they didn't. But I am also not going to pretend they were what the story is about. They were the tide coming in. The tide always goes out again. I told the children their father existed when they were old enough to ask and young enough to accept a measured answer. He lives far away, I said. He is important to many people. He does not know about you yet, and that is my choice, made to protect you. Reese accepted this in the straightforward way that Reese accepts most things that are not immediately reversible. He filed it as information, asked if the man was nice, and returned to his tide pool. Ren was quiet for a long moment. Then she went to her drawing box, and for 3 days she drew a figure she would not show me. Tall, she said eventually. He is probably tall. Like Reese will be. I think he has sad eyes. I did not confirm. Yes, Kalen said. His voice had gone quiet. They're mine, I said again, and this time I meant the other thing. Their names are not Voss. Their home is not the stronghold. Their lives are not political instruments. You are their biology. You are not yet their father. Those are different words with different weights, and before this conversation goes any further, I need you to understand the distance between them. He was quiet for long enough that I knew he was actually listening and not simply waiting for the space to reply. Then he said, "What are their names?" I told him. Reese, who had been listening to all of this with the air of a child attending an interesting meeting, immediately said, "I ate one of the shells. It was soft. I thought it was already broken." He said this directly to Kalen, with the confessional energy of a person who has decided the sad man at the gate looks trustworthy and might as well know the full situation from the start. Kalen looked at Reese for a moment. Something in his face shifted, just slightly, just enough. He said, "I once ate part of an inkberry from my mother's garden because my older brother told me they were sweet. They are not sweet." I was ill for 2 days. Your instinct is correct. It is always the soft ones. Rhys considered this gravely and nodded. There was an immediate quality of alliance in the nod that I observed and chose not to address. Ren had turned around. She was looking at Kaelin with the careful, cataloging attention she gives to things she is not sure about yet, but intends to understand. Then she reached into her apron pocket and produced the charcoal sketch, the tall figure with iron-gray eyes, and held it up. You look like the drawing I made, she said. Kaelin looked at the drawing. Something crossed his face that was not grief exactly, but was in the same country. He said, When did you draw that? Last week, Ren said. I drew it from looking at Rhys. I thought about what the other half might look like. The gate post was doing significant structural work again. I let him have the bench by the seawall. 5 feet of salt-weathered wood between us, the afternoon sun on the water, the children running the tide line in the middle distance with the focused energy of small people who have been given a project. I set the terms clearly and without cruelty, because cruelty was not the point. Daytime visits only. My presence required. No disclosure to the children of who he was without my signal, though I suspected Ren had already made her own assessment and filed it under provisional conclusions. No contact between the Elder Council and my family. No Iron Veil riders appearing at my door with summons or title or any of the other administrative machinery of a life I had deliberately placed myself outside of. He accepted every condition without a single counter. The fastest and most complete capitulation in the history of a man who negotiates the borders of entire territories for a living. I had expected bargaining. I had prepared for bargaining. The absence of it was so unexpected that I spent a full minute after he finished accepting simply sitting with it, checking for the trick. There was no trick. He said, However you need this to go. And then he looked at the children on the tide line, and he did not say anything else, and I understood that whatever else was complicated about this moment, that part, his understanding of what he was looking at and what it cost, and what it would cost still, was not complicated at all. The sea lavender was growing back where his boots had crushed it. Sea lavender does that. It does not accept defeat from boots. I had chosen it specifically for that reason, though I had not known at the time that I was making a choice about anything other than a hedge. Chapter 4. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. He had taken a room at Ashford's only in a narrow, salt-damp building 2 streets back from the harbor that catered primarily to fishing merchants and occasionally, with an air of resigned tolerance, to everything else. He conducted himself in the town with the specific low-visibility deliberateness of a man who is trying very hard not to be what he is, which in Kaelin's case meant no crest, no guard, no title, and an expression carefully calibrated to suggest that he was simply a man in a coat who had business on the coast and no particular claims on anyone's attention. Ashford, which had spent 300 years making its own decisions about what it noticed and what it didn't, chose not to notice. On the 3rd morning, he asked if we could speak. The children were in the garden. He looked at the seawall bench. I looked at the seawall bench. We sat on the seawall bench. He told me what had happened after I left. The bond ceremony had produced nothing. Not a flicker, not a partial seal, not even the low resonance that sometimes passes between 2 wolves who are compatible but not fated. Silence. Isolde stood at the altar with her hands folded and her expression composed, and Kaelin stood across from her with the invocation spoken, and the bond did not answer, because the bond knew what the council had refused to consider. You cannot reassign a fated mate by administrative decree. The wolf does not negotiate with paperwork. Separate chambers from the first night. For attempted remediation rituals in the following months, an elder rite, a blood circle ceremony, a long-distance summoning that required 3 practicing shamans and produced, according to Kalen, approximately nothing except a very large invoice. His wolf pulled west every night. Not metaphorically. He woke each morning having rolled toward the western wall, and on the nights he couldn't sleep he stood at his window and felt the pull like a compass needle that had decided north was somewhere across the Ashford Sea. I listened to all of this with my hands folded in my lap and my face arranged in the expression I have cultivated over 5 years for moments when I need to hear something difficult and not allow the difficulty to rearrange me before I have finished hearing it. Then he told me about Isolde. She had written to Brennan herself. 6 weeks before our wedding, 6 weeks before the morning I stood in the antechamber with flowers in my hair counting to 20, she had written a letter to the first elder of the Voss War Council presenting the pureblood bloodline argument. She had outlined the strategic advantages in full. She had called the existing mate bond an inconvenience and noted that mate bonds, historically, were not unbreakable in cases of political necessity. She had offered herself as the solution. Brennan had brought it to the council. The council had brought it to Kalen. And Kalen, who had been receiving territorial pressure from 3 border lords for 2 months, and who had a council full of men who spoke the language of strategy and not the language of what his wolf was telling him every morning, had looked at the argument, and the map, and the political weight of the Northern Expansion Accords, and he had said yes. He did not dress this up either. He told me what he had done the way a man tells the truth about something he has been carrying for years and has run out of ways to make lighter, plainly and with the full weight of it in his voice. I asked him for an hour. I walked to the cliff above the western sea, the high flat promontory above the Ashford harbor where the wind comes in clean and cold off the open water, and there is nothing between you and the horizon for as far as you can see. I stood in the cold salt air, and I gave the old pain its moment. Not because I owed it anything, but because grief that is not given room becomes something harder, something that calcifies in the chest and changes shape over years into something unrecognizable. And I had not spent 5 years learning how to build a life only to fill it with the hurt I hadn't let go. I cried for Kalen first. For the morning. For the bond that had known and been overruled. For the man who had stood at the altar with locked jaw and white knuckles, and had not looked up because he had known that if he looked up he would not be able to do what he had decided to do. Then I cried for Isolde. For longer. Because I had loved her. Because I had braided her hair on summer mornings and believed she looked at me the way a younger sister looks at an older one, with some mixture of rivalry and affection, and the complicated inheritance of 2 people raised under the same roof. I had been wrong. She had looked at me the way a person looks at a resource, with calculation and patience, and the specific detachment of someone who has already decided what they intend to do with it. I did not hate her for it. Hatred would have required me to give her more of my interior than I was willing to. What I felt was something colder and more final, the closing of an account. The careful, deliberate removal of a person from the category of people whose opinions of me carried any weight. Then I stood in the salt wind for a few minutes longer until I was done. Because grief is a tide. It comes in and it goes out, and the shore is still there when it recedes. You do not live inside the tide. You live on the shore, and you let the water come and go, and when it goes you are still standing. I walked back. Kalen was exactly where I had left him. He had not moved, had not apparently breathed in any particularly relaxed way, and was holding a small piece of driftwood that Wren had apparently handed him at some point in my absence, and which he was holding with the careful attention of a man who has been entrusted with something fragile and is not going to be the one to drop it. I sat back down on the seawall bench. 5 feet between us, the same as before. Thank you, I said, for telling me plainly. He nodded. It does not change anything yet, I said. But it changes the shape of it. I needed to know the shape. He said he understood. I believed him. Ren came and took her driftwood back. She had apparently decided he had held it long enough. Chapter 5. He learned the title schedule first. Not from me, I had not offered it, but from the harbor master's board at the end of the main street, which Ashford updated each morning with the same unhurried civic reliability with which it did everything. I found out when Reese mentioned, on the 4th day, that the tall man at the gate had arrived at exactly the right time for the low-tide hermit crab emergence, which Reese considered a significant display of competence for someone who did not yet understand the title schedule well enough to have planned it and must therefore have checked. The tall man had checked. Reese approved of this. He brought nothing. That was the other thing I noticed. He came each morning with only himself and the specific, careful restraint of a man who understands he is operating on someone else's terms and is not going to compromise that understanding by arriving with gifts or gestures or anything that could be read as an attempt to purchase goodwill he had not earned. The children noticed. Ren noticed everything. Reese noticed the things that mattered to Reese, which was mainly whether someone was paying proper attention to the tide pools, and Kaylin, it turned out, paid proper attention to the tide pools. Reese added him to the creature taxonomy as a provisional research assistant. This was, in Reese's social world, a significant honor. Ren's process was different. She observed from a distance for 3 days, the way she observes everything she is not sure about, with a scientist's patience and a child's unflinching honesty. On the 4th day, she brought her drawing box to the rocks and sat near him, not with him, and drew. On the 5th day, she showed him the drawing. It was of a sea anemone, anatomically precise in the way all of Ren's drawings are anatomically precise, with the tentacles extended in full feeding posture. He looked at it for a long time. He said, I have never seen one extend like this. Can they retract? Ren told him everything she knew about sea anemone retraction, which was considerable. He listened with the full attention of someone who is actually learning something, not performing interest, and Ren, who can detect the difference with an accuracy that still occasionally unnerves me, filed this information and did not show him another drawing that day, but came and sat approximately 2 feet closer to him on the rocks. I watched all of this from the garden wall. I am not going to pretend I was not watching. I had watched everything for 5 years because watching was how I kept my children safe, and I was not going to stop now simply because the thing I was watching was a man behaving better than I had prepared myself for him to behave. On the 6th day, I found him sitting alone at the edge of the tide pool with his boots off and his feet in the cold water, his eyes on the horizon, and nobody watching him except me. He did not know I was there. He sat with the specific stillness of a man who has finally found a moment in which nothing is required of him and is not entirely sure what to do with that, but is not going to waste it by moving. His shoulders had dropped. His jaw had unclenched. He looked, for the first time since he had appeared at my gate, like a person rather than a position. I said, "What are you doing?" He said, without turning, remembering what it feels like to be a person rather than a position. Something in my chest shifted. Not softened, I am precise about that, because softening and shifting are not the same thing, and I had spent too long building myself carefully to be imprecise about my own interior. Shifted. Like a weight that has been balanced in one particular way for a long time, and has discovered it can also be balanced differently, and is not yet sure which way is more correct, but is at least acknowledging that more than one way exists. I went back inside and did not mention it. My mother had been conducting her own assessment in parallel. Sarah Marin's process for evaluating a person is not subtle. She simply stops speaking to them entirely while she decides, which she had done to Dara when they first met, and to the harbor master's new deputy, and once, memorably, to a well-meaning elder from the village who had made an observation about Wren's drawings that my mother considered insufficiently respectful of the intelligence on display. She did not speak to Kalen for 4 days. He accepted this with the composure of a man who has faced opposition councils and considers 4 days of deliberate silence a manageable obstacle. On the 5th day, she served him tea. No comment. No greeting. She simply set a cup in front of him at the kitchen table and returned to her herbs. He drank it. He did not thank her effusively or remark on it or attempt to use it as an opening for conversation. He drank the tea, and then he helped Reese count the shells on the windowsill. There were 7, all present and accounted for, and then he left. On the 6th morning, my mother was grinding herbs at the kitchen table when he arrived, and she looked at him once and said, "You walked away from my daughter in the worst way a person can walk away. I am giving you tea because she asked me to be civil. The morning you make her cry again, there is no territory in this world where you will feel safe." He said, "I understand." She said, "I am going to teach you my bread recipe." He blinked. She was already measuring flour. His first attempt was dense and slightly burnt on one side. She said nothing, which was its own verdict. His second attempt was better. His third attempt she lifted from the cloth, examined, pressed with one finger to test the crumb, and then set back down and said, without inflection, "Acceptable." In my mother's vocabulary, acceptable is a standing ovation. He did not know this yet, but he ate the bread with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has passed a test he did not entirely understand and has decided not to question the terms, and I thought, he is learning. He is actually, carefully, without performance or fanfare, learning what this coast costs. And it is costing him something real, and he is paying it. That was the day I moved the bench 6 inches closer to the garden wall. He did not comment on this either. He simply sat where the bench was. He was learning. Slowly, in the only way that counts. Chapter 6. The carriage arrived on a Wednesday. I remember that specifically because Wednesday is my longest morning in the practice. 3 appointments before noon, the last one a woman in her 38th week who had been having intermittent contractions and needed careful monitoring. And so I was already tired when I heard the wheels on the lane, and already in no particular humor for what was about to require a great deal of me. It bore the Iron Veil crest. Small, on the door panel, discreet, the way the Iron Veil crests its surveillance carriages, as though the small crest is somehow less an announcement than a large one. I knew it immediately. I had grown up with that crest on the correspondence that arrived for my father, and on the treaty documents my father's household managed, and on the letterhead of every administrative communication from a territory that had, for most of my life, represented the world to which I was supposed to belong. It looked very small against the gray Ashford morning. Isolde stepped out. I had not seen her in 5 years. She was gold-haired, as she had always been, and sharp-featured, and held herself with the careful erectness of someone who has learned that posture communicates authority to the people who mistake posture for authority. She was wearing deep blue Iron Veil's ceremonial color and the wolf tooth pendant that should have been on her collarbone if the bond had sealed was not there, because the bond had not sealed. And she had known for 5 years that the absence at her throat was visible to anyone who knew where to look. She looked well. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the journey and everything to do with the specific exhaustion of a person who has been inhabiting a position that does not fit them and has not yet admitted this to themselves. I recognized that tiredness. I had felt it once, in the 20 seconds before I made the first true decision of my life. A man stepped out behind her. Not a guard, an elder, by the cut of his coat, younger than Brennan, but bearing the same administrative posture. The same expression of someone who is present to manage a transaction and would appreciate if the transaction proceeded without excessive complication. He had a satchel. The satchel had papers in it. I had a very clear sense of what the papers said. I set down the monitoring chart I was carrying. I was in my midwife's apron, which has a specific kind of authority of its own, the authority of a woman who has been elbow-deep in the most fundamental work of human existence and is not particularly impressed by political delegation. I walked to the garden gate. I did not open it. Ava, Isolde said. I said her name back. Just the name. No warmth, no coldness. A name. She told me what the Elder Council wanted. The twins were Voss heirs. Under Iron Veil succession law, heirs of Alpha bloodline were subject to council oversight regarding upbringing, education, and eventual preparation for the responsibilities of their lineage. The Alpha King had authorized this visit. She said this with a specific, careful emphasis, and I noted the emphasis, and I filed it. And the council was prepared to offer substantial material support for the children's welfare in exchange for a cooperative arrangement regarding their Iron Veil upbringing. She spoke for approximately 2 minutes. She spoke well. She always spoke well. It is a genuine skill, the ability to make a property claim sound like a gift. I let her finish. Then I said, under Iron Veil succession law, the determination of an heir's welfare is vested in the parent of primary residence in all cases where the alpha parent has not established an active parental role as defined by consistent physical presence and documented care. The parent of primary residence is me. The active parental role has not been established by anyone. These children are not currently subject to council oversight because the conditions that would trigger that oversight have not been met, and if any elder of the Voss War Council places a political claim on my children without my written consent, I will document it as a welfare interference under the Independent Territories Accord, which Ashford signed in the second year of the Iron Veil expansion and has never rescinded, and I will pursue it in every available forum with the full 5 years of evidence I have accumulated. The elder with the satchel stopped reaching for his papers. I was not finished. I am not a scheduling conflict, I said. I am not a territory negotiation. I am not a pureblood bloodline problem that required an elegant administrative solution. I am the woman who raised the only heirs to the Iron Veil throne alone, without a single coin or title or protection or acknowledgement from the Dominion, for 5 years, in a town that does not appear on your territorial registers. My children know the names of every creature in the tide pools. They know how bread is made. They know how to be kind to people who are tired. They do not know what it feels like to be assessed for political utility, and they are not going to learn it from a council that looked at their mother and decided she was an inconvenience. Isolde was very still. You have changed, she said, finally. I said, I became myself. There is a difference. Something moved behind her eyes. Not guilt. Guilt requires the admission of a wrong, and I do not think she was there yet, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, perhaps. The specific wince of a person who has looked at the shape of what they did and found it less elegant than they remember. This coastline, I said, because she was looking at the sea lavender hedge, and I wanted her to understand, has a way of burning everything unnecessary off. You are welcome to feel that. You are not welcome to stay. She left. The elder with the satchel left. The carriage with its small discreet crest left. I stood at the garden gate for a long moment after the wheels had gone quiet. Then I went back inside and finished my monitoring chart and checked in on my 38-week patient and told her the contractions were regular and she should rest and come to me the moment they were less than 8 minutes apart. My hands were steady the whole time. That is what 5 years builds. Not invincibility. Steadiness. The particular, hard-won steadiness of a woman who has stood in the cold salt air long enough to know that she does not move unless she chooses to. Chapter 7. Kaylin stayed. This surprised me less than I expected it to. I had prepared myself for a version of events in which Isolde's arrival and departure triggered something in the administrative machinery, a summons, a legal maneuver. A council rider arriving with papers that required his immediate return to the stronghold to manage the fallout of whatever Isolde had reported back. None of that came. What came was Tuesday morning and Kaylin at the garden gate with the title schedule memorized and a small package of waxed parchment that turned out to contain 3 different varieties of pressed sea moss that Reese had mentioned wanting for a classification project. Acquired from the harbor market the previous afternoon without instruction from anyone. Reese made the kind of noise that Reese makes when something has exceeded his expectations. It is a particular sound, high and sharp, and immediately followed by 17 questions. Kaylin answered all 17 questions with the patience of a man who is not performing patience, but actually has it, or has decided to develop it on the spot, which in practice amounts to the same thing. He conducted his Iron Veil correspondence by post. I know because the harbor master's office flagged it to me, not as a complaint, but as information, offered in the way Ashford offers information about things it considers relevant to the people it considers its own. He is writing a lot of letters, the harbor master's deputy told me, over a cup of tea in the Tuesday market. Governing by post, apparently. Is he very important? I said, he is. She said, he bought 4 of the fishmonger's best cod yesterday and paid double and said nothing about it. That is considered here an adequate substitute for being important. He was learning the coast. Not just the title schedule, the coast. The names of the fishing families. The particular problem with the North Harbor Wall that had been argued over for 3 years without resolution, about which he had apparently developed opinions after one conversation with the harbor master. The specific mood of the weather off the point in the late afternoon, which changes in ways that matter to people who live near it and do not matter at all to people who are simply visiting. He asked questions the way a man asks questions when he is building a map, not collecting curiosities. Ashford noticed. Ashford continued its policy of productive non-noticing, which in this context meant accepting his custom at the fishmonger and saying nothing about the crests on his correspondence. I told the children on a Tuesday. I had been choosing the right morning for 2 weeks, and then I stopped choosing and simply did it, because the right morning was always going to be an ordinary morning, and there was nothing to be gained from making it elaborate. We were at the kitchen table. Wren had her drawing box. Reese was counting the shells on the windowsill, all 7, which he checked every morning with the devotion of a small person who has been given a responsibility and takes it seriously. The tall man, I said, who comes in the mornings. He has your eyes. He is your father. Reese turned from the windowsill. He processed this for approximately 6 seconds, which for Reese constitutes deep deliberation. Then he said, "Does that mean the tide pool drawings are in my blood?" I said I believe so. He said, "Good," and went back to counting shells. Wren did not say anything. She sat very still with her pencil in her hand and her drawing box open in front of her and looked at the table. I let the quiet be. She needed a moment, and I knew what to do with the moment that needed to be quiet. Outside the window, the sea was doing its ordinary Tuesday morning things, and the kitchen smelled of my mother's bread, and the world was the same world it had been 30 seconds ago. Then Wren tore her piece of bread in half. She placed one piece on the empty chair beside her. She did not look up. She did not say anything dramatic. She placed the bread on the chair with the deliberate care of a child making an offering, and then she picked up her pencil and began to draw. I had to look out the window for a moment. Not love, not forgiveness. Something earlier than both, the conditional, fragile admission of a child who has decided to extend something precious to someone who has not yet proved they deserve it, and wants them to feel the full weight of that. One piece of bread. The whole architecture of invitation and caution and hope in it. If that does not do something complicated to your chest, you are built differently than I am. Kaylin arrived 40 minutes later to find the bread waiting on the chair. Wren was still drawing. Reese was explaining the complete taxonomy of the Ashford tide pools, which takes approximately 20 minutes at minimum speed, and which Kaylin sat down to receive with the full attention of a man who understands he has been given access to something and is not going to waste it. He ate the bread. He looked at Wren while he ate it with the expression of a man who is holding something very carefully and is aware of how easily it could be dropped. She did not look up from her drawing, but the corner of her mouth moved. That evening, after they had gone, I found the drawing she had left on the table. It was of the kitchen, the table, the window, the shelves on the sill. 5 chairs. 2 of them occupied by small figures with the easy sprawl of children who are at home everywhere. 1 large figure at the head, which I recognized as my mother from the herb bundles. 1 figure on the right side, which I recognized as myself from the apron. And 1 new figure on the left, taller than the others, sitting in the chair where the bread had been, with careful iron gray eyes and an expression she had labeled, in her precise child's handwriting, at the bottom of the figure, still learning. Not dad. Not father. Not yet. Still learning. She had given him exactly the right amount. Chapter 8. We went to the cliff the evening after Wren left the drawing. Not by arrangement. He had been leaving at his usual hour, and I had been standing at the garden gate watching the day go, and he had stopped at the gate, and I had opened it. And we had walked to the cliff in the way that people sometimes walk somewhere without quite deciding to, propelled by something that has been building for weeks and has finally identified a direction. The evening was clear. The kind of clear that only happens on the Ashford coast in autumn, when the fog has pulled back and the stars are fully visible and the horizon is a clean, unbroken line between the dark water and the darker sky. We stood at the cliff edge with enough distance between us to maintain the fiction of neutrality, and I did not pretend I was maintaining it, and he did not pretend he expected me to. He told me the legal shape of things. The bond failure was documented under 3 separate council witnesses. An Alpha King's bond ceremony that produces no seal is categorized under ancient Iron Veil law as a void contract, not dissolved, not annulled, but void from inception, which is a different and more complete word. A void contract carries no obligations forward. He could petition for formal dissolution, which would require council ratification, which, given that 3 witnesses had already documented the failure, would be procedurally straightforward. He would be, after dissolution, an Alpha King without a Luna. His council would consider this a vulnerability. He had spent considerable time recently becoming indifferent to things his council considered vulnerabilities. I said, I am not returning to the stronghold. He said, I know. I said, the twins will not be raised as political instruments. He said, I know. I said, if you dissolve the marriage and want to be their father, their real father, which means breakfast and tide pools and shell counts and bread recipes and the full ordinary accumulation of a life lived in proximity, then you come here. Not they come to you. You come here. You learn what this coast costs. You carry what I have carried in whatever way is yours to carry it. And then, after enough tides and enough mornings and enough drawings in which Ren adds you to the family without being asked, we talk about what comes next. He looked at the water for a long moment. Then he said, I have been coming here every morning for 3 weeks, and I do not know yet what this coast costs. I know it costs something. I know I am learning the shape of it. But I don't know the whole of it. I said, no. You don't. He said, however long that takes. I said, then start proving it. Not with words. With breakfast. We stood at the cliff for a while longer without speaking. The stars were very clear. The bond was there, it is always there, it has never not been there. A frequency that runs between us like a current that does not care whether we are paying attention to it or not. I had learned over 5 years to live alongside that frequency without letting it govern me. I had redistributed it into midwifery and motherhood and sea lavender and the specific love of a woman who has chosen every piece of her own life and finds that choice in itself sustaining. The frequency had always been mine. I had simply stopped letting it define the only possible destination. But I could feel it. Standing on the cliff in the clear autumn evening with Kalen Voss 3 feet to my left, I could feel it the way you feel a tide coming in the dark, not yet at your feet, but coming. The pressure of it changed in the air. Inevitable and unhurried and entirely indifferent to whether you are ready. He felt it too. I could tell by the quality of his stillness. I said, good night. He said, good night. And then, thank you. For the cliff. For the terms. For the bread my daughter left on a chair. I said, that was her decision. Not mine. Take it up with her when she decides you've earned a second piece. Something in his face did the thing it had been doing more frequently lately, that shift. That particular rearrangement of a man who is being rebuilt from the inside out by ordinary mornings and a child's conditional bread, and the specific unwillingness of a woman who loves him to make any of it easy. Not a smile. Something more structural than a smile. I walked back down the cliff path. The sea lavender was silver in the dark below the garden wall. Chapter 9. The dissolution papers arrived on a Friday. I know because Friday is market day in Ashford, and I had been at the harbor market since early morning with my mother. She needed new grinding stones and had strong opinions about which vendor to purchase them from, which meant attending the market itself rather than sending anyone else, and when I returned the papers were on my kitchen table and Kaylin was at the window, and my mother was at the herb shelf with her back carefully turned to both of us, which was its own form of privacy. I read them. They were precise and complete and worded in the formal language of Iron Vale legal architecture, which is to say they were approximately 400 words longer than necessary and covered every procedural contingency with the thoroughness of a system that has been managing wolf politics for 300 years and has developed a healthy respect for the complications that arise when you do it poorly. The central facts were simple. The bond ceremony had produced no seal. This had been witnessed and documented. Under the ancient bond failure statutes, the contract was void from inception. The formal dissolution was a procedural confirmation of something that had been legally true since the night of the ceremony, which was to say that Kalen Voss had technically been a free man for 5 years, and Isolde had technically been the holder of a title to which she had never been bonded, and the Iron Vale Elder Council had spent those 5 years maintaining a political fiction that had consumed the governing energy of an entire territory. I signed the document that acknowledged my awareness of the dissolution. My signature was required not as a party to the dissolved marriage, I had never been a party to it, but as the primary parent of the acknowledged heirs, whose legal status was clarified by the dissolution, and who were now formally recognized under Iron Vale law as the children of the Alpha King, with all accompanying protections. It was a strange thing to sign. I held the pen for a moment before I used it, not from hesitation, but from the specific quality of attention I always give to things I cannot unsign. Then I signed it. Isolde did not contest the dissolution. Kaelin told me this afterward, on the seawall bench, with the afternoon sea doing its ordinary afternoon things behind him. She had received the papers in the southern estates, where she had returned after her visit to Ashford, and she had signed them within 2 days and sent them back without comment. He said, "I think she was relieved." I said, "I know she was relieved." I had seen it in her face at the garden gate. The specific tiredness of a woman who has been inhabiting a position that does not belong to her and is running out of the energy required to maintain the pretense that it does. You can want something badly enough to take it. You cannot want it badly enough to make it fit. She had known for years that the crown was the wrong shape. The dissolution was not a defeat for her, it was a permission she had been waiting too long to ask for. I did not forgive her. I want to be clear about that. Forgiveness is a specific thing with a specific cost, and I was not there yet, and I was not going to pretend I was in the interest of a tidy narrative. What I felt was something quieter and more sustainable. I had stopped carrying her as a wound. She had made choices that were cruel and self-serving, and those choices had cost me the morning I had planned and introduced me to 5 years of sea lavender and my own considerable capability. And the accounting was complicated enough that I was not ready to close it. But I had set it down. I was no longer walking with it in my hands. Brennan resigned the day after the dissolution was ratified by the council. The exposure of his role in the original substitution, which had been documented as part of the dissolution proceedings, the procedural thoroughness of Iron Vale law being, in this instance, extremely useful, was sufficient to make his continued presence on the council untenable. He did not contest this either. He was an old man who had spent 50 years optimizing the territory and had made one calculation that had cost the Alpha King his fated mate and the territory its Luna, and he was tired, and the coast had not, in the end, been available to burn everything unnecessary off him in time. The council restructured. Younger members. People who spoke the language of governance without the specific vocabulary of entitlement that Brennan's generation had cultivated. Kaelin said it was not a revolution. I said, no, but it might be the beginning of one. He governed from Ashford for 3 months. The converted fisherman's warehouse at the end of the harbor, the one that had been used as a salt packing facility for 40 years before the fishing consortium moved east, became, in the autumn of that year, the administrative center of the Iron Vale Territory's northern correspondence. The harbor master found this extremely interesting. Ashford found it characteristic. An Alpha King willing to govern from a warehouse with seagulls on the roof was either very confident or very desperate, and either way he was buying cod from the fishmonger at twice the going rate, and his children were polite at the market, which was the main thing. On the morning after the dissolution was confirmed, my mother prepared tea. 2 cups. She had prepared 1 cup every morning for 5 years, mine. She had prepared 1 cup when Kaelin was first given tea, with the clear implication that the tea was a civic courtesy and not an invitation. 2 cups meant something different. 2 cups meant she had decided. She set them on the table. She did not say anything. She went back to her herbs. It was the quietest ceremony I had ever witnessed. But then my mother has always understood that the things which actually change your life rarely announce themselves. Chapter 10. The sea lavender had grown back. I noticed it on a Wednesday morning in late autumn, standing at the garden gate with tea I hadn't drunk yet, looking at the eastern wall where his boots had crushed a section of it the first day he arrived. It had been coming back for weeks. Sea lavender does not accept defeat from boots, or from anything else, which is why I chose it, and now it was fully regrown, the silver-green stems as dense as they had ever been. The last of the season's flowers holding against the cold with the specific stubbornness of things that were designed to hold. I went inside and got his tea and brought it to him. He was in the garden, kneeling at the herb bed, his hands in the soil up to the wrist. He had been learning the herb garden in the same careful, incremental way he had learned everything else about this coast, by asking questions, by watching what I did, by making mistakes and correcting them without drama. He had killed 2 of the fennel plants in the first week by overwatering, and my mother had told him so with the precision of a woman who considers unnecessary plant death a failure of attention. And he had sat with that correction, and then bought 2 new fennel seedlings from the harbor market and replanted them himself and not killed them. They were doing well. My mother had mentioned this to him exactly once, which in her economy of compliment was considerable. I knelt beside him. My hands are always dirtier than his in the herb garden because I do not think about keeping them clean in the way that a person who has spent most of their life in formal settings sometimes still does, without meaning to. He noticed the first time, and then he stopped noticing, which was the right progression. This coast has a way of teaching people what actually matters, if they stay long enough to let it. We worked in the garden for a while in the companionable silence of 2 people who have had all the important conversations and have arrived at the particular quiet that lives on the other side of them. The morning was cold and clear. From the cottage I could hear Reese explaining something to Wren at considerable volume. The words were indistinct, but the confidence was not, which meant it was either about tide pools or bread. The 2 subjects on which Reese currently considers himself an authority. From my mother's corner of the garden came the familiar sound of her mortar, steady and unhurried, the rhythm of someone who has been grinding herbs for 50 years and has achieved a kind of meditative efficiency with it. Kaelin said, to the fennel, I have been thinking about what Wren said. About probationary status. I said, what about it? He said, I would like to know when it ends. I said, you will have to ask her. He said, I know. I am working up to it. Something happened in my chest that I did not try to contain or explain or file away for later examination. Something warm and unhurried that had been building for weeks in the same tide-like way that everything that matters builds on this coast. Not dramatic, not declared, just arriving at the point where it could not be anything other than what it was. I had spent 5 years learning that love is not something that happens to you. It is something you build and choose and tend and rebuild when the storms get into it. I had built it alone, and it had been enough, and it was still enough, and it was also standing in this herb garden with this man's hands in the soil beside mine, not the whole of what it could be. I kissed him. Salt on both our hands and cold air and the smell of fennel and my mother's mortar going steady in her corner of the garden. The bond thawed the way a tide comes in at night. You don't see it arrive. You only know it has because the water is somewhere it wasn't before, and it is not going to stop being there. It did not reignite dramatically. It did not announce itself. It simply expanded. The way the sea expands when the tide fills a cove, inevitable and unhurried and complete. The frequency I had redistributed into midwifery and motherhood and sea lavender for 5 years made room. It is capable of more than I had let it be. It was always capable of more. He kissed me back with the full attention of a man who has been waiting a very long time for the right morning and is not going to treat it as anything other than the most important thing that has happened to him this year. It was a promise, not a new one. The promise had always existed, unspoken, running underneath everything like a current that does not require acknowledgement to be real. This was just the first time it had been spoken aloud. The next morning, Kaylin was in the kitchen before anyone else. I heard him from the bedroom, the careful sounds of a man moving through someone else's kitchen with the specific, considerate quietness of a person who understands that being trusted with the kitchen at this hour is not a small thing and does not intend to treat it as one. The particular soft knock of the bread tin being set on the counter. The low sigh of the oven draft being checked. The sound of my mother's recipe, written on the card she had given him 4 weeks ago and which he had kept in his coat pocket ever since, being unfolded with the care of a man consulting a document he has studied but is not yet confident enough in to trust his memory alone. I went to the kitchen doorway. He was in my mother's coastal apron. The one with the small blue anchors, which she has worn for 20 years and which is completely and utterly absurd on a man of Kaylin's size, the strings barely tied behind him, the chest panel ending approximately 6 inches above where it was intended to end. The whole garment suggesting a man who had borrowed something important and was wearing it with full sincerity regardless of the scale mismatch. He was consulting the recipe card with one hand and measuring flour with the other, and he had flour on his jaw, which meant he had been running his hand over his face while he thought, which is a thing he does when he is concentrating. And he had not yet noticed me in the doorway. The bread was going to be good. I could tell from the smell of the dough already working. His 3rd attempt had been acceptable. His 9th was going to be right. I went back to bed. I lay in the morning light and I listened to the sounds of the kitchen and the sea outside the window and Reese beginning to stir in the room next door, talking to himself in the confident, directionless way of a child whose thoughts are already running ahead of the day. Wren was quiet, which meant she was already awake and drawing or observing, 2 activities she conducts with the same focused silence. 5 years. 1,825 days. A life built entirely from the decision made in 20 seconds in a candlelit antechamber. It was whole. It had always been whole, complete and sovereign and belonging entirely to itself. It had room for more. It had always had room for more. I had simply needed long enough on this coast to understand that having room is not the same as needing to fill it, and that the person you let into the room you have built should be someone who understands the difference. He understood the difference. He had learned it one morning at a time, one shell count, one bread attempt, one piece of bread left on an empty chair by a child who gave him exactly the right amount and waited to see what he did with it. He had done the right things with it. The bread was warm by the time we were all at the table. My mother sat at her end with both hands around her cup, the particular satisfied quiet of a woman whose assessment has been confirmed by evidence over time, which is the only kind of confirmation she trusts. Reese was counting the shells on the windowsill, the 7 that are always there, always all 7. Because Reese has been given a responsibility and takes it seriously, and Kaylin has understood from the very early days that the shells are not to be disturbed before the morning count is complete. Wren had left a drawing on the table. She left it face up, centered between the breadboard and the jam, in the position of something placed deliberately and not accidentally. A family of 5 on the shore. The sea behind them, the cottage behind the sea lavender hedge, the tide pools in the foreground with small careful creatures in them. The figures were labeled in her precise handwriting. Mama, Grandma, Reese, with an arrow to a figure that was clearly gesturing at something in the tide pool. Me, the figure with the drawing box, naturally. And the tall figure, last, with the iron-gray eyes she had inherited from him and drawn back onto him with the careful rightness of a child who understands where things come from and is not troubled by that. She had written, Dad. No qualifier. No parenthetical. The word by itself, which is the whole word, the complete weight of it. Then below it, in smaller letters, in parentheses, crossed out with one clean stroke. Probationary. Kaelin looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he looked at Ren, who was eating her bread with the composed attention of someone who has made a decision and does not require it to be discussed in order for it to be real. She glanced up, met his eyes. Then she tore a piece from her bread and put it on his plate, not the half piece of before, not the careful rationed offering of a child extending something fragile. A full piece, freely given. He ate it. He said nothing, because nothing was what the moment required. Outside the window, the sea was doing its ordinary morning things. The tide was coming in. The sea lavender was silver-green along the eastern wall, all of it fully grown, none of it crushed. The shells on the windowsill numbered 7. The bread was warm. The table was set for 5. And the wolf tooth pendant was back around my collarbone, where it had always belonged, cool and solid and not going anywhere.
If you enjoy watching this story, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.